Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. This is part 2 of my two-part post regarding the Emperor Tiberius. And this is part of the Roman Emperor's Reading Challenge that I inaugurated a few months ago. A lot of the information in this post will be drawn from Robin Seager's biography of Tiberius, but also from other sources, some of the original sources and some other more modern historians about this. But this is the primary source I'll be quoting and drawing on. And Tiberius, the second of the Roman emperors, he was the adopted son of Augustus, who was the first emperor. And Tiberius will reign from the death of Augustus in the year 14 until Tiberius' own death in 37. Now, in part 1 of my post about Tiberius, I made some general remarks about Tiberius as emperor and some things noticeable about his personality we get from the original sources, but I want to go deeper into that with this second part and follow through to the end of his life. I also want to begin by discussing Tiberius's family background. And I'm going to do this for a reason, and I'll explain that shortly. Well, anyway, let me just start with this. Tiberius was born in the year 42 BC. His full name was Tiberius Claudius Nero. Now, some of you who know the history of the Roman emperors might find that a bit ironic that Tiberius' name incorporates the two emperors that come after him, Claudius and Nero. At any rate, Tiberius' father was of the same name. His father was also Tiberius Claudius Nero. This was a very common practice among the Romans for fathers to give their sons their own names and to continue this practice down through the generations. It's something that's still practiced in many cultures among many peoples to this day. So anyway, his father was a Roman praetor, which meant that his father was very high in the Roman imperial government, and also that his father was a high-ranking member in the Roman military. His mother, Tiberius' mother, was Livia Drusilla. She was the daughter of a Roman senator whose full name was Marcus Livius Drusus Claudianus. Now, think about those two names. Tiberius' father was Tiberius Claudius Nero. Tiberius' mother was the daughter of Marcus Livius Drusus Claudianus. In other words, both of his parents were members of the Claudian tribe. The Claudian family tribe was one of the most illustrious in Roman history. There are Claudians going all the way back to the earliest days of the Roman Republic. There are members of the Claudian tribe who fight in the Roman conquest. There are members of the Claudian tribe who are leading statesmen, who give great speeches in the Senate, who defend Rome, who build the roadways, who help build the empire. The Claudian family was not to be messed with. These were the greatest of the Roman aristocratic families. They could even claim to trace their lineage back to the founding of the city. These were patricians, first-rate patricians. So Tiberius was born into this very illustrious family. In the year 38 BC, Augustus, who by that time was beginning to feel all of the many privileges that came with the great power that he had essentially inherited from his late stepfather, Julius Caesar, he encounters Livia, Tiberius' mother, and must have her. So he forces Livia's husband, Tiberius' father, to divorce Livia, which he does. And again, it seems an odd practice to us, but in some situations, if someone who was more powerful than you or of higher status than you in society wanted your wife, you had to surrender your wife. And by this time, Augustus is emerging as the major power in Rome. This concept of an emperor, although the Romans would deny there was any such thing as an emperor at this time, but that's what was happening. Augustus is like the imperator, the conquering general, the blessed one, the anointed one. If this man says, I want your wife, you surrender your wife. And Augustus had gained a reputation for stealing other men's wives by this time, but in this case, the sources seem to suggest that perhaps Augustus, it wasn't just that he was smitten with Livia, he really loved her, and she reciprocated this. There seemed to be a genuine affection between the two. And not long after Livia's husband divorces her, she and Augustus marry. and the marriage will stick. It will last throughout the rest of Augustus's life and Livia's life. Again, an unusual thing at a time when divorces were very common in Roman society. So it does seem like there was a real affection between these two people who will become incredibly influential and powerful. In terms of Tiberius, though, what this meant was that, well, first of all, Augustus was a member of the Julian clan, right? His adopted father was Julius Caesar. Livia, of course, is a member of the Claudian clan. These two families have now married. The Julio-Claudian families have married together. This is a real powerhouse in terms of social status, lineage, ancestry. You don't get any more powerful than these two families connected together in this way. So Tiberius, Augustus eventually adopts Tiberius. So Tiberius is a Julio-Claudian. And in fact, even though Tiberius was the second Roman emperor, he was the first of the Julio-Claudians. And the Julio-Claudian emperors are Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Some of the most colorful, curious, repulsive personalities in all of Roman history. The first of the emperors come from this Julio-Claudian house. At any rate, excuse me. So Augustus marries Livia, and Livia she actually has two sons, Tiberius and Drusus. But for Augustus, it's important that his power be passed on to someone of the Julian clan, someone of the blood. Augustus had been married before, and he only had one child, a daughter named Julia. It was a daughter he had by a previous wife named Scribonia. And so it was important to Augustus that he marry his daughter Julia to someone, an illustrious Roman, so that Julia could produce a male heir. And so Augustus marries off his daughter to one of his nephews, Marcus Claudius Marcellus. But not long after that, Marcellus will die of food poisoning around the year 23 BC. Now, you hear food poisoning, excuse me, poison had become the go-to method for removing your political rivals at this time in Roman history. There were professional poisoners. And sometimes people will raise eyebrows at this, but there may have been some shenanigans behind the scenes. Food poisoning, though, was very common at this time in history. In fact, food poisoning has been common up until about 100 years ago, so maybe it was just an innocent event. But as far as Augustus was concerned, this was a tragic, not because his daughter's husband had died, but because no male heir had been produced. So then Augustus arranges for his daughter Livia to marry Agrippa. Augustus's closest friend and advisor, the man that Augustus turned to in times of military conflict to lead major military campaigns. Agrippa looms large in the history of Augustus. Excuse me. I'm begging your patience here. It's been about a week since I posted anything of any great length. It's because I have this awful cough I'm trying to get rid of. It's going away, so anyway, I beg your indulgence, but thank you. So anyway, Augustus arranges for his daughter Julia to marry Agrippa. And here, this marriage will produce 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. 3 sons, just what Augustus was looking for. The sons will be Gaius, Lucius, and Agrippa, posthumous. And then there'll be the 2 daughters, Julia the younger and Agrippina the elder. Each one of these characters will play a major role in what's about to happen in Roman imperial succession. Gaius and Lucius, the first 2 children of Julia and Agrippa, were immediately adopted by Augustus and kind of tagged to be the heirs to the great power that Augustus had. Okay, but Augustus did not ignore the 2 sons that Livia brought into the marriage. He also adopted Tiberius, the future emperor, and Tiberius' brother Drusus. And he gave them great honors and great powers in their own right. And both Tiberius and Drusus would go on to lead the Roman legions to tremendous victories in the Germanic territories, which were always in upheaval. Now, here's what happens. When Agrippa dies in 12 BC, Tiberius was ordered by Augustus to marry Julia. Agrippa's widow. And what Augustus is doing here is he's trying to guarantee that there'll be some family lineage, that the bloodline will not be broken. So he's marrying his adopted son, Tiberius, to his daughter to make sure that the children of Julia and Agrippa will still be connected to the house of Augustus. I know that seems rather odd, quite a reach, but it was a very common concern and a very common action to take at this time in Roman history. Okay. The problem with this is Tiberius hated this arrangement. By this time, Julia, the daughter of Augustus, had gained a reputation of being, let's say, a woman of easy virtue, a party girl, much to Augustus's embarrassment and everything else. And Tiberius had already been married. He'd been married to a woman named Vipsania, who he truly loved, and he was forced to divorce her and marry Julia, who Tiberius couldn't stand. And so this, creates for Tiberius a great resentment of getting pulled into these family political angles and ties and everything else. So he hated the arrangement, but he had no choice. And I should also add, by this time, Tiberius's brother Drusus had died. He died from an accident. He fell off a horse. So Tiberius is kind of, he has to maintain and raise the sons of Julia by a previous marriage. So Tiberius could kind of guarantee that those boys would grow up to be the inheritors of Augustus's power, is essentially what's going on. But Tiberius was disgusted with the arrangement. And then in the year 6 BC, Tiberius did a really unexpected thing, something that really angered Augustus. Tiberius went into voluntary exile. He said, I've had enough. I don't like being married to Livia. I miss my wife, Vipsania. I can never see her again. I hate the politics. I hate everything that's happening here. I'm being knocked around. I'm being manipulated by everyone. And so he leaves Rome. He self-exiles to the island of Rhodes. And this caused great resentment from Augustus. And so you get this kind of tension between the emperor, the Imperator Augustus, and Tiberius, who Augustus looked upon as the person who would help Augustus ensure that the next emperor would be of the Julian bloodline. But it wouldn't be Tiberius. Tiberius wasn't in the running at this time. Now, here's what happens. Again, please excuse me. Both Lucius and Gaius, Augustus's grandsons, by his daughter Julia and Agrippa, died early deaths, unexpectedly within a couple of years of each other. And then Julia will get exiled because of her scandalous behavior. She's sent away to an island to die. Augustus now has to figure out what he's going to do. Remember, by his daughter, he had actually 3 grandsons. Lucius, who is dead by the year 2, Gaius, who dies in the year 4. But then there's Agrippa Postumus, a very curious figure in the Julio-Claudian family at this time. He was unstable, I guess we could say, a man of violent temper. Everyone feared him. In fact, he'd been sent into exile to an island of Planasia because, there's no way he was going to inherit the imperial power. Augustus really didn't know what to do with the boy. But he's out of the running. So now Augustus has to figure out where's the male heir going to come from. And for a brief time, he considered perhaps Ullius Antonius, who was the son of Mark Antony, perhaps adopting him. But and the reason that the connection between Mark Antony and Julius Caesar was very strong, and so Augustus says, well, maybe I'll appoint the son of Mark Antony to be my heir because of his connection to my stepfather. But then somewhere along the line, that person commits suicide. Apparently he wanted nothing to do with this as well. As it turned out, it left, Augustus was then forced to recognize Tiberius as the heir. Tiberius wins by default as the next emperor. And in fact, when Tiberius is named emperor, Agrippa Postumus is immediately executed. He's strangled to death. And Tiberius is informed of this. We've killed Agrippa Postumus. Tiberius said, why did you kill him? He goes, on your orders, sir. He goes, I didn't order you to kill him. And Tiberius would maintain this, that he never ordered the death of Agrippa Postumus. We think what happened there was Augustus wanted to make sure that once Tiberius was named emperor, any rival for the throne, in this case, Agrippa, would be moved out of the way quietly. And so, anyway, so there's that story. Okay. Tiberius, was recalled to Rome, and he was officially adopted by Augustus. And then Augustus orders Tiberius to adopt his nephews, Germanicus, his nephew Germanicus. Germanicus was the son of Tiberius's now deceased brother Drusus. Okay. And Germanicus did have a blood tie to Augustus. He was a biological great nephew. Okay. And then Germanicus will subsequently marry Augustus's granddaughter, Agrippina. So now the situation we have is that Tiberius, who seems to be in Augustus's mind kind of a placeholder, is going to hold that power until Germanicus can be granted the power of imperator. So Augustus has kind of marked Germanicus to be his true successor. And Tiberius knew this, and he resented this. He realized he's just being manipulated. He's not anyone's first choice for anything. He just has to surrender to Augustus's will. And that's eventually how this comes down. And eventually how this will work out. When Augustus dies, Tiberius is named emperor, but with the understanding that when Germanicus, who at this time was fighting in the east, returns in victory, Tiberius will lay down that power and give it to Germanicus. And Tiberius knew this. He resented the manipulation. Now, as far as all these family ties, you can put your pens down now. I know that was very confusing to keep all these different characters correct. And I've noticed in pretty much any biography of any of the Caesars, any of the emperors, there's always going to be the genealogy, the family tree. This is the one in Seager's book, and it's not complete. He just focuses on the immediate successors to, or those predecessors to Tiberius. But the reason I think it's important to keep this stuff in mind, as confusing as it is to remember that the Roman emperors did not become emperors because of their own political platforms. These were not young men who entered into politics and gained a following and made grand speeches and got voted into high office and eventually become emperors. That's not how it worked. The Roman emperors were members of families. These were powerful families that would seize power and then hang on to it for dear life. And that's what Tiberius, he comes from this Julio-Claudian family. And these imperial families, and there'll be families after Augustus's time, after Tiberius. Nero is the last of the Julio-Claudians. Then you get the Flavian emperors. There's that family, and then it goes on and on. It's important to keep this in mind because these families, these Roman families, are these huge extended families. There are nephews and grandnephews and nieces and grandnieces, and there's adopted sons, and there's divorced wives, and it's very, very confusing to keep everyone straight. Who gets to be the emperor? It's the one who is the most, or the one who's kind of recognized as the head of the family at that time. These are family issues here, and it explains a lot of behaviors. Any large family, you're going to have certain family members that are happy to be who they are. Others have ambitions. Some will have ambitions that are crushed by other family members. Others will become very resentful if they don't get their inheritance on time and everything else. That's exactly what's happening with these Roman emperors. They're coming out of these very confused family relationships. So I think, as I continue the Roman emperors reading challenge and we get into some of these other emperors, I'm not always going to walk you through the family genealogy, but keep it in mind how confused this is. Now, in the background, we've got these enormous, these kind of dynamic psychological stresses and strains that are placed on these men who eventually become emperors. And they're always family stresses. So at any rate, that's the deal with Tiberius. That was the background that he came from. So regarding Tiberius, and again, to go back to the book that I was drawing on mostly for this post, Robin Seager, he does a good job of discussing Tiberius's role in the Roman Empire before he became emperor. And one of the things that's often forgotten about Tiberius is when he was in his 20s and 30s, he really made a name for himself as a great Roman general. He was in charge of legions, trying to nail down all the disruptions in the Germanic territories, and he did it with great skill. His troops seemed to have loved him. In fact, Seager says that in one of these uprisings in the German territories, Tiberius's actions were, quote, generalship at its best. So Tiberius was a wonderful military man, probably one of Rome's greatest. And had it not been for this family issue that led to his having to become the emperor, he might have been remembered as one of Rome's greatest generals. Okay? But then when Tiberius becomes emperor, he becomes emperor at the death of Augustus in the year 14. Tiberius is clearly hesitant to accept this power. He does not want this. And in fact, he makes a speech to the Senate saying he doesn't want it. He's showing great humility. Now, this will become a part of what's expected of everyone when they become emperor. You have to act like, oh, I don't really want this power. Because if it looks like you want it, then you're too ambitious, and then people suspect that maybe you're going to become a tyrant. But in Tiberius's case, it seemed like he was being very sincere in this. He didn't want this power. He was willing to lay it down. He was even hinting that if it would be possible, at some point he's going to surrender the power completely and reestablish the Republic. But in time, Tiberius will become really disgusted how the Senate is so obsequious and the magistrates always bow to him. There'll be votes, and Tiberius will cast his vote last, and it throws everyone into a tizzy because no one wants to vote in a way that would be opposite of what Tiberius would later vote for. And he would say, no, vote your consciences. Don't worry about me. But they would, because of Augustus's example, because everyone feared Augustus, they now fear Tiberius, and he really, really resented this. But he's often, he prevaricates, he disseminates, he never quite says exactly what he's thinking because he doesn't want to intimidate others, and then things would often turn out strangely or unexpectedly for him. As Seager notes in his biography, and I'm quoting from page 27, bafflement in an unexpected and embarrassing situation is characteristic of Tiberius throughout his life. Anyway, Tiberius becomes emperor in the year 14, and by that time he was 54 years old. Even by our standards, that's well into middle age. By Roman standards, he's an old man. In other words, he finally becomes emperor, and he's too old to really enjoy it. But he does the best he can, and he starts to rely a lot on Germanicus, his adopted son, who was actually his nephew. Germanicus at this time is in the east, comes out of the Germanic territories, and is fighting in the east because there's great disruption up there. And Tiberius is really looking to Germanicus to maintain the integrity of the empire, which Germanicus does to great success. To such success that Germanicus becomes very popular, very well known to the Romans as this defender of the empire. And from that, Tiberius starts to get suspicious. He gets a little nervous. Is Germanicus going to perhaps make a bid for leadership? Is Germanicus going to march back to Rome and overthrow Tiberius? So Tiberius begins to pull back a little bit. How much do I support this kid? Is this kid a threat to even my life? In the Roman Empire at this time, sometimes political advancement was advancement based on assassination. So slowly but surely, Tiberius becomes very insecure, becomes very paranoid, and he comes to distrust Germanicus. And of course, these fears and this paranoia are being fed to him even by his own mother, Livia. Watch out for Germanicus, he's up to something. And then Germanicus dies before he gets back to Rome. He seemed to have died of a wound that he suffered in a battle. And there's nothing in the sources to suggest it was anything other than that. And you have to remember, this is great antiquity. You could die from a broken leg. You get a broken leg, by the end of the week you're dead from gangrene or something. So it's quite possible that Germanicus, whatever this wound was, that he did die from it. But later there would be rumors that maybe Livia arranged for the poisoning of Germanicus with Tiberius's approval. I think in Robert Graves' famous fictional work, I, Claudius, that's an implication that he makes. But at any rate, with the death of Germanicus, Tiberius now has a potential rival moved out of the way. But still, it doesn't remove the paranoia and fear that Tiberius would experience for the rest of his life, and it would grow constantly. He was constantly in fear that people were out to get him, people were out to do him wrong in some way. And then, of course, near the end of Tiberius's life, he'll put a lot of trust in the captain of the Praetorian Guard, a fellow by the name of Sejanus. And of course, Sejanus really was plotting against Tiberius. And when Tiberius discovers that this man he trusted above all others was actually plotting to kill him, Sejanus gets executed. And then there's mass executions throughout the empire of anyone who was connected to Sejanus in any way, are put on trial. Some of them commit suicide, some of them run away into exile, some are hunted down and murdered and everything else. And Tiberius's reign ends up in a bloody massacre because of his paranoia, which achieved great heights. And in fact, by that time, Tiberius wasn't even living in Rome anymore. He had moved to Capri because Tiberius even the Roman people didn't like him. He didn't like them, they didn't like him. And part of the reason was, Tiberius didn't have that gregarious, outgoing personality that Augustus allegedly had. Augustus loved the games, he loved the chariot races, he loved entertainment, he loved the theater. Tiberius didn't like any of that stuff. He was a kind of a retiring kind of guy. And so he disappears to his palace in Capri, and he's governing from there, relying on Sejanus. And then he finds out Sejanus is turned against him as well. So these imperial decrees come from the palace in Capri, kill this man, kill that man, put that man on trial. And it just gets really ugly and very, very tragic. And it kind of really smears and darkens Tiberius's reputation forever. So what is Tiberius's importance to the Principate, which was the fancy name for the emperors, the first of the citizens? What role did he really play in the history of emperors? He was a bitter guy, very resentful, but when he came to power, it was his father Augustus who created this office of emperor, which was a legal fiction. There was really nothing like that in the Roman Constitution. But Augustus, through steady manipulation of events, the tearing down of some institutions, the rebuilding of others, but rebuilding them in such a way that a power would accrue to him, that Augustus created this office where he was the center of all things. But it was a kind of a rickety structure. And so when Tiberius came into that office, it was his job to firm up that structure. Okay? And as I said, at first it seemed like he didn't want to firm it up. He wanted it to collapse so the Republic could return. However, Augustus had done such a thorough job of creating the office of emperor that if Tiberius had allowed that office to disintegrate, it would have put Tiberius in great danger. He wanted to destroy the only thing that was protecting him from possible execution or assassination. So he was stuck. He didn't want this, but he had to maintain it. And his importance to the history of the Principate was simply that. He inherits this rickety office of imperator, and he firms it up. He's like the concrete that pulls it all together and will maintain this curious position in the imperial government for the next four centuries or so. So he's very important in the history of the Principate in that regard. As far as the death of Tiberius, there's a couple different versions of what happened. They all agree on two things. Number one, that he died in his bed in his palace in Capri. Okay, and I think he was about 76 years old when he died. Anyway, he dies in his bed on Capri. But what did he die of? Old age? He was sick? Was he murdered? The other thing that all the accounts agree on is that there was someone present when Tiberius died. And the person there in that room, along with some others, the one person that's always there in all the different versions of this, was Tiberius's young nephew, Gaius, better known in history as Caligula. And some of the sources suggest that Caligula may have had a hand in helping Tiberius die a little bit quicker than he might have normally. But that will bring us to the third of the Roman emperors, and the second Julio-Claudian, the infamous Caligula. And for that, I will be drawing on this. This is a fairly recent biography of Caligula by Alois Winterling. I'm not really familiar with him. It's a very brief book, and I'm not going to linger a whole lot on Caligula. Some of you might be disappointed in hearing that because there's a lot of scandal and very strange things that Caligula does. We're talking sexual license, unmatched in history, sensationalistic acts of deviancy, unimaginable, a whole litany of bizarre things that Caligula did or was accused of doing. It makes for salacious and entertainment, but I'm more interested in the office of the emperor. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'll mention enough of it, but I really want to talk about Caligula's importance to the development of the office of Roman emperor. And he does have some importance in that regard, although it wasn't by his design. And in fact, he only reigns for about 4 years. But Caligula will be the next emperor we talk about. Before we go, I did want to say a couple things about Robin Seager's biography of Tiberius. It's a very good biography, one of the best. I really enjoyed it. But there are times when Robin Seager seems to be padding out the text a little bit. When Tiberius becomes emperor, those Germanic territories, which were always in upheaval, Germanicus was there, nailing things down a little bit. And in one section of this book, Seager goes on and on and on about all these different battles, how they were fought, the strategies that were used, how Germanicus, moved his troops around, a revolt among the troops. And in those pages, and it goes on for 20, 30 pages, Tiberius isn't mentioned at all. This was supposed to be a biography of Tiberius, and it is, and it's a good one, but there are times when Tiberius isn't part of the story. Now, those events that happened to Germanicus, they would be important to Tiberius's reign, but only later on. And I think Seager the book would have been a little bit shorter had he summarized those military campaigns into a few paragraphs and gotten directly to the point. How did this relate to Tiberius? So there's a bit of padding in here. However, if you're interested in Roman military history, those chapters are fascinating. I love that stuff. But I think for some of you who might be joining me on this Roman Emperor's reading challenge, and if you chose this book, you might have been a bit baffled about halfway through. Like, what happened to Tiberius? But it's still a good book. I would just caution any of you who want to read it, if you want to study the reign of Tiberius more deeply. It's a good book, but do be aware that there is some extended sections in here dealing with Roman military campaigns that only indirectly impacted Tiberius. So that's it for Tiberius. Next up is Caligula. I want to thank you. I've been suffering from some kind of respiratory thing. I haven't been able to put up any solid posts for a while now, and I didn't want to lose sight of the Roman Emperor reading challenge, so I wanted to get this one up here. I've got a couple of other ideas too. And I want to thank you for indulging me every time I have this hacking cough. I know if I were to spend a little extra time in mastering the technology, I could edit out those coughs, but I'm not interested in mastering the technology. I'm fine with the way things are. And so I want to thank you for indulging me in this. One more sip of water. And a fond goodbye until next time. Keep reading. Stay strong.